In 1933, as bread lines stretched for blocks and factories sat silent across the industrial world, two men sat in different rooms, in different countries, staring at the same catastrophe and seeing completely different causes. One believed the crash had exposed a fatal weakness in capitalism itself, that markets, left alone, could spiral into paralysis and fear, trapping nations in unemployment for years. The other believed the disaster was not a failure of markets, but a failure of manipulation, that artificial credit, easy money, and government interference had inflated a bubble that was always destined to burst. One argued that governments must spend when everyone else is too afraid to, even if it means borrowing at unprecedented levels. The other warned that such spending would only delay recovery, distort prices further, and plant the seeds of an even greater crisis in the future. Their names were John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek. And while most people have never read their books, the world you live in today, the interest rates you pay, the taxes you owe, the inflation you feel, the bailouts you witness, has been shaped by the outcome of their intellectual war. This wasn't a debate held in lecture halls alone. It influenced how America responded to the Great Depression. It shaped post-war Europe. It defined the policies of presidents, prime ministers, and central bankers for nearly a century. During recessions, governments leaned toward Keynes. During inflation crises, they rediscovered Hayek. Back and forth, like a pendulum swinging through history. And what makes this story powerful isn't just that two economists disagreed. It's that their disagreement split the modern world into two competing visions of how prosperity is created, how crises should be handled, and whether stability comes from intervention or restraint. This was not just theory. It was a battle over who should control the steering wheel of the global economy, markets or governments. And once that battle began, it never truly ended. Welcome to Empire Economics, where we tell the stories behind the systems that shape our world. Today, we're stepping into one of the most consequential intellectual clashes in economic history. A clash that quietly determined how nations would fight recessions, manage growth, and justify trillions in public spending. But to understand why Keynes and Hayek mattered so much, we have to return to the chaos that made their ideas unavoidable. When the global economy collapsed in the early 1930s, unemployment in the United States surged past 20%. Banks failed in waves. International trade shrank dramatically. Entire industries froze. For many, capitalism itself seemed broken. And in that moment of fear, Keynes offered something radical: the idea that governments could step in, deliberately run deficits, stimulate demand, and pull economies out of paralysis. Spend when others won't. Borrow if you must. Act boldly. It was a message that felt practical, urgent, and humane in a world desperate for solutions. Meanwhile, Hayek cautioned that the crisis had deeper roots, that years of artificially low interest rates and credit expansion had misled businesses into unsustainable investments. According to him, recessions were painful but necessary corrections, moments when the economy had to cleanse itself of distortions before real recovery could begin. Intervening too aggressively, he warned, would only postpone the reckoning. Two frameworks, two diagnoses, two prescriptions, and governments had to choose. What followed over the next decades was not a clean victory for one side, but a shifting dominance, from the New Deal to post-war expansion, from the stagflation of the 1970s to the free market resurgence of the 1980s, and into the modern era of central banking and stimulus packages. Every major economic crisis since the Great Depression has reopened the same argument. Do we spend our way out, or step back and let markets recalibrate? That recurring question is the echo of Keynes and Hayek. And as we move through this story, you'll see how their ideas didn't just compete in academic journals. They built institutions, justified policy revolutions, and defined the rules of modern economic governance. This is not merely a debate from the past. It is the invisible framework beneath today's headlines. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. To understand why this debate became so powerful, we need to understand the scale of the collapse that gave it oxygen. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. But the crash itself was only the spark. What followed was something much deeper. Banks failed not because they were reckless speculators alone, but because fear spread faster than facts. Depositors rushed to withdraw money. Businesses cut investment. Consumers stopped spending. International lending dried up. Within 3 years, industrial production in the United States had fallen by nearly half. In Germany, unemployment soared into the millions. Global trade contracted dramatically. Entire communities lost their savings when banks collapsed. This wasn't just a downturn, it was paralysis. And here was the real problem. The economic playbook at the time offered no clear solution. Governments were told to balance budgets, maintain the gold standard, avoid deficit spending, let prices adjust naturally. But as wages fell and businesses closed, adjustment didn't bring recovery. It brought more contraction. Falling incomes meant falling demand. Falling demand meant more layoffs. The system fed on itself. To many observers, it looked as if capitalism had entered a death spiral. And in Britain, a brilliant, unconventional economist named John Maynard Keynes watched this unfold with growing frustration. He believed something fundamental had been misunderstood. Markets, he argued, were not always self-correcting in the short run. Fear could become rational. Hoarding cash could become logical. And when everyone tried to save at the same time, total income simply shrank. This was his breakthrough idea, what he called the paradox of thrift. Individually, saving more during hard times makes sense. But collectively, if everyone saves and no one spends, businesses earn less, workers lose jobs, and the economy contracts further. In that environment, waiting for markets to fix themselves could mean waiting for years. Meanwhile, in Austria, Friedrich Hayek had been studying a different mechanism entirely. He believed the roots of the crash lay not in insufficient spending, but in excessive credit expansion during the 1920s. Central banks, by keeping interest rates artificially low, had encouraged unsustainable investments, projects that only looked profitable because money was cheap. When reality caught up, those investments had to be liquidated. The recession, in his view, was not a failure of capitalism, but a correction, a painful but necessary clearing of mistakes. Where Keynes saw insufficient demand, Hayek saw distorted signals. Where Keynes saw paralysis, Hayek saw misallocation. Where Keynes proposed stimulus, Hayek warned of deeper distortion. And here's what made the clash explosive. Both men were responding to the same catastrophe, but they were speaking to different fears. Keynes spoke to the fear of unemployment, social unrest, and lost generations. Hayek spoke to the fear of inflation, state overreach, and long-term instability. Governments had to decide
which fear they believed was more dangerous. In the early 1930s, as democracies wavered and extremist movements gained traction, that decision carried consequences far beyond economics. It wasn't just about interest rates or budgets anymore. It was about preserving social order. And that urgency would push leaders, particularly in the United States, toward bold experimentation. The stage was set. The economy was collapsing. Public confidence was shattered. And two competing blueprints for recovery were now circulating in the halls of power. What happened next would not only shape the remainder of the Great Depression, it would define how modern governments think about crisis itself.
For a while, it seemed as if Keynes had won. After World War II, governments across the Western world embraced deficit spending and active economic management. Growth surged. Unemployment remained relatively low. The post-war boom felt like proof that intervention worked. Universities taught Keynes as the dominant framework. Policymakers spoke his language. The idea that governments could smooth the business cycle became conventional wisdom. But history doesn't move in straight lines. In the 1970s, inflation surged while growth stalled. Unemployment rose. Stagflation, a combination many economists believed shouldn't exist. Suddenly, the old tools seemed blunt. More spending risked fueling inflation. Tightening risked deepening unemployment. Confidence faltered. And in that uncertainty, Hayek's warnings resurfaced. He had argued that excessive credit expansion and intervention distort price signals, and that those distortions eventually demand correction. Inflation, in his view, was not random. It was structural. By the 1980s, policy shifted. Tighter monetary control, greater emphasis on markets. Central banks focused heavily on controlling inflation. The pendulum had swung. But here's what's remarkable. It never stopped swinging. During the 2008 financial crisis, governments unleashed massive stimulus, a distinctly Keynesian response. During inflation spikes decades later, central banks tightened aggressively, echoing Hayek's caution. Back and forth, stimulus and restraint, expansion and correction. The modern economy doesn't belong to one of them. It operates in the tension between both. Every bailout debate, every interest rate hike, every argument about government spending, they are echoes of a disagreement that began nearly a century ago. Empires aren't always built with armies. Sometimes they're built with ideas. And the ideas of Keynes and Hayek became the invisible architecture of modern capitalism. The next time you hear about stimulus packages or inflation fears, you'll know you're watching that pendulum swing again. If you enjoy exploring the ideas that quietly shape the world's empires, the systems behind the headlines, and the economics that most people never see, you're in the right place. This is Empire Economics. Thank you for watching.